The town of Gideon's Creek had a way of making certain people feel like they didn't belong there, even after 30 years of residence. Delilah Harper had been born in a two-room house on the edge of that town, and she had spent most of her life being reminded in small and large ways that she was taking up more space than she'd earned. It wasn't just her size, though that was always what people reached for first. It was something harder to name, the particular kind of discomfort that certain people felt when they encountered a woman who refused to disappear. Delilah was not loud. She was not confrontational, but she had a presence that some found irritating, the way a fire that won't go out becomes irritating when you've spent a good hour trying to smother it. She was 28 years old. She had worked most of those years in one capacity or another, washing other people's laundry, minding other people's children, cooking in a boarding house kitchen until the owner's wife decided she didn't like the way the male boarders complimented the food. That last dismissal had come on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near the woman's eyes. "We're going in a different direction with the kitchen," Mrs. Hollis had said. The different direction turned out to be the Hollis's 17-year-old niece, who burned the biscuits 3 mornings in a row before the boarders started asking pointed questions. Delilah had heard about that from Margaret Pruitt, who had heard it from her husband, who took his meals at the boarding house. Margaret had relayed this information with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering news they believe will comfort you, not realizing that it doesn't, because the job is still gone and the niece still has it. That had been 6 weeks before the advertisement appeared in the Gideon's Creek Courier. Cook wanted. Callaway Ranch, 12 miles northwest, room and board included, wages negotiable. Experience required, strong constitution preferred. Inquire at the post office. Delilah had read it twice standing at the post office counter, then folded it and put it in her apron pocket. She'd taken it out 3 times that evening, read it again each time, and finally written a letter that she rewrote 4 times before she was satisfied it sounded capable rather than desperate. The distinction mattered. She'd learned early that desperation was the one quality that guaranteed you wouldn't get what you needed. The response came back in 9 days, written in a hand that was businesslike and brief. Report on the 15th. Bring your own bedding. Wages would be $11 a month with room and meals. She was to present herself to the foreman, a man named Gil Haskell. She had $7.40 to her name. She borrowed $2 from Margaret Pruitt, spent 3 of the total on a second-hand bag large enough to hold the things she owned worth keeping, and walked the 12 miles to Callaway Ranch on a morning in April when the sky was the particular flat gray that comes before a season decides what it wants to be. The ranch materialized out of the landscape the way large things sometimes do, gradually and then all at once. First there was a fence line that seemed to go on longer than was reasonable, then a barn that was bigger than the boarding house where she'd worked, then the main house, which was 2 stories of weathered timber with a long porch running its entire front length, practical and unadorned. There were outbuildings she couldn't immediately identify, corrals with horses moving restlessly inside them, a bunkhouse set back from the main structures, and men, 6 of them visible even at this hour, moving with the particular purposeful tiredness of people who had been working since before the light came up. Gil Haskell was waiting for her near the main house, as if he'd been watching her approach from the moment she'd come into view. He was a compact man in his 50s with a face that looked like it had been left out in the weather and never brought back in. He wore a hat pushed back on his head, and he had his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at something he didn't order, when the thing he did order was what he was counting on. "You're the cook," he said. It wasn't a question. Delilah Harper. He took in her carpet bag, her dress, her size. She let him look because there was nothing to be done about it, and she had learned that the fastest way through this particular moment was to stand still and let people get it out of their system. "Had somebody else in mind?" he said finally. "Wrote back to 2 others before the letter came saying they'd both taken other positions. You're what's left." "Then I suppose we're both working with what's available," she said. He blinked. Apparently that wasn't the response he'd been expecting. "Kitchen's in the back of the main house. You'll see the state of it. Last cook left 3 weeks ago, and nobody's been back there but me, and I'm no cook." He paused. "That's not a warning. That's just information." "Understood. Bunkhouse has a back room. Small. That's where you'll sleep. Men eat at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening, sometimes later if they're riding in from the far pasture. 15 men when everyone's here. 13 right now." He looked at her again. You said in your letter you've done quantity cooking. 4 years at the Hollis boarding house, never fewer than 20 at table. He considered this. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. Kitchen's back there. Get started on noon meal. Whatever you can put together with what's there. He turned and walked away, and that was the entirety of her orientation. She found the kitchen. It was a disaster, not catastrophically so. The bones of it were sound, a good iron range, a deep sink, adequate shelving, but it had the particular disorder of a space that had been used without care for weeks. Grease on the stovetop, a pot with something dried in the bottom that she declined to investigate too closely, flour that had been left open and gone partly stale, bacon going in a direction it shouldn't. She set down her bag. She tied on her apron. She started a fire in the range, and while it caught, she took inventory of what she had to work with, moving systematically through the shelves and the cold storage, making lists in her head. She could hear men's voices somewhere nearby, the bunkhouse probably. And she couldn't make out words, but she could hear laughter, and she had a reasonable suspicion about the subject. It did not particularly matter. They could laugh at whatever they wanted. At noon they were going to eat, and then the conversation would shift. She made biscuits from the stale flour, working it until the texture came right. She found dried beans and set them soaking. She found potatoes, a lot of potatoes, and she put a pot on to boil, and while it did, she scrubbed the range and the sink and the worst of the shelving. She found a partial slab of bacon that was acceptable and rendered it down for the grease she needed. She found cornmeal and made a thick porridge that she sweetened with the small amount of molasses that remained in a jug in the back of the cabinet. By 11:30, she had beans with bacon, boiled potatoes with rendered drippings, biscuits, and the cornmeal porridge set off to the side for whoever wanted it. It wasn't impressive food. It was good food, solid and hot and substantial, which was what men working a ranch needed at midday. The hands came in at noon in a cluster, tracking mud, smelling of horses and sweat, loud with the residual energy of the morning's work. She watched them come through and find their places at the long table, and she watched the moment when they registered what was on it, the quick recalibration from whatever they'd expected to what was actually there. "Huh," said one of them, a red-haired man with a burn scar on one forearm. He looked at the biscuits, then at Delilah, then back at the biscuits. He took 3. "Don't take all of them, Clyde," said the man next to him without looking up. "I took 3. "I know how many you took." She served. She moved around the table with the efficiency she'd developed over years of serving larger groups in smaller kitchens, and she watched the food disappear with the speed that told her she'd gotten the quantities right and the taste acceptable. Nobody complimented her. That was fine. Compliments came later. What mattered now was empty plates. Most of them left without comment. A few nodded in her direction, acknowledgement without enthusiasm. One man, broad-shouldered, probably 40, with a dark beard threaded with gray, paused on his way out and looked at her directly. "Biscuits were good," he said. His voice was low, and he said it simply, like a man reporting a fact. "Thank you." He nodded once and went out. She didn't know his name yet. She found out later from Gil Haskell's muttered introduction at dinner that his name was Rhett Calloway, and that he was one of the ranch hands, had been there longer than most, kept to himself, did his work, and wasn't a problem. She stored this away with everything else and got back to the dishes. The first week was an education. She had thought she knew what hard work was. She had worked hard her whole life. But there was ranch work, and then there was everything else. And what she'd been doing her whole life fell definitively into the second category. The kitchen at Calloway Ranch required her to be up by 4:30 to have breakfast ready by 6. Breakfast meant biscuits or cornbread, eggs when there were enough, salt pork or bacon, coffee. Always coffee, and it had to be strong or the men would say nothing but their faces said everything. By the time breakfast was cleared and the dishes done, it was past 8, and then there was the noon meal to begin preparing, which meant bread if she had time. Always something hot and substantial, and enough of it. In between the cooking, there was the kitchen itself to maintain, the stores to manage and track, the weekly trip into Gideon's Creek with the supply list that Gil Haskell approved and sometimes argued about. 40 pounds of flour, he said on her first supply run, looking at her list. That's what we need for the week. We've been getting by on 25, and the bread is why the men come back from the far pasture before dark. You want to change that arrangement? We can use 25 pounds. He looked at her. She looked back. He put 40 pounds on the wagon. She slept in the back room of the bunkhouse, which was separated from the main sleeping quarters by a thin wall that did not do a great deal for privacy of sound. She could hear the men's conversations in the evenings, which meant that early on she was aware of what they thought of her, since men who live together in close quarters don't usually think much about who might be listening. "Big woman," said one voice she hadn't yet matched to a face. "You see the size of her?" "Saw it." Gil must have been desperate. "She can cook," said a third voice. This one she recognized. It was Clyde, the red-haired one, the one who'd taken 3 biscuits. "Anybody can cook." "Not like that, they can't. You eat those biscuits, or did you waste them?" A pause. "I ate them." "Then shut up about it." This did not end the conversation, but it redirected it, and Delilah lay on her narrow cot in the back room and listened and decided that Clyde was useful to know. The harder assessments came from other quarters. 2 of the younger hands, she learned their names were Porter and Dutch, which she was fairly sure was not the second one's actual name, but nobody seemed to question it, made a project of her in those first days. Not aggressively. They were too practiced for anything that direct. It was the smaller things. The comment made just loud enough to hear, the joke that landed just at the edge of her earshot, the particular kind of casual cruelty that young men develop when they're not being supervised, and they've found a target they think won't push back. She didn't push back. She understood that pushing back was what they were hoping for. What she did instead was cook. She fed them 3 times a day with the best food she could produce from the supplies she had, and she did it consistently, without complaint, without asking for acknowledgement. It was a particular kind of patience she'd been developing for 28 years. It had gotten her through worse than 2 ranch hands who thought themselves more amusing than they were. What surprised her was the land itself. She hadn't expected to feel anything about it. It was a place to work, a place to sleep, a fixed number of miles from the town where her life had so far mostly happened. But the ranch at dawn, the particular quality of the light coming across the flat ground and hitting the fences and the outbuildings and the horses moving in the corrals, was something she hadn't prepared herself for. She started getting up a few minutes earlier than necessary. Not many, 4:40 instead of 4:30. Just enough time to stand outside the kitchen door for a few minutes in the dark and watch the light come up. It cost her nothing, and she got something from it that she couldn't fully name. One morning in her second week, she was standing in that familiar spot when she became aware that she wasn't alone. She turned to find Rhett Calloway leaning against the fence post nearest the kitchen door, arms folded, watching the same stretch of sky she'd been watching. She didn't know how long he'd been there. She hadn't heard him approach. "Sorry," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. "Don't be." He looked at her briefly and then back at the horizon. "You're not in my way." They stood in silence for a few minutes. The light changed incrementally, the gray warming towards something that might eventually become color. Somewhere in the corrals, a horse moved and another one answered. "You're up early," she said, because the silence had length to it, and she wasn't entirely comfortable yet with silences that had length. "Always am." He wasn't elaborating, and she had the impression that this wasn't rudeness, but just an economy of words she'd have to get used to. "Rhett Calloway," she said, though she already knew this. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." He looked at her again, and something moved across his face that might have been amusement, though it didn't commit to becoming a smile. Gil doesn't introduce people. He just expects everybody to figure it out eventually. "How long have you been here?" A pause. "A while." "That's not a number." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She let it go. She had coffee to put on and biscuits to start, and she had already given herself 4 minutes more than she'd planned. She went back inside and left him to the fence post and the changing light, and she thought about the way he'd said, "You're not in my way," not as a reassurance, but as a simple statement of fact, like a man who'd had occasion to think about space and who occupied it and who didn't. It was, she realized later, the first time since she'd arrived that anyone had said anything to her that didn't contain a hidden evaluation of some kind. And by the end of her first month, she had learned the rhythms of the place well enough that the work no longer exhausted her in the way it had those first days. Her body had adapted, the way bodies do when you push them past what they think is possible. The hands that had cramped around the rolling pin in the first week were tougher now, and the back that had screamed in protest at the long hours at the range had gone quiet in the way that pain goes quiet when it realizes you're not going to stop. She had also started to understand the men she was feeding. Clyde was straightforward. A decent man who worked hard and didn't complicate things, who'd grown up poor and appreciated consistent food with the sincerity of someone who remembered what inconsistency felt like. He brought his dishes to the kitchen without being asked, which no one else did, and once when she was working a particularly stubborn barrel of salt pork, he appeared at the kitchen door and said, "You need that opened?" And when she said yes, he opened it without ceremony and went back to whatever he'd been doing. Porter and Dutch remained peripheral irritants, though Porter had pulled back somewhat after an incident involving a comment about her weight that Clyde had overheard and responded to with a bluntness that left Porter apparently reconsidering some things. She hadn't witnessed this directly. She'd heard it through the wall and pretended she hadn't. Some information was better received indirectly. Gil Haskell was revealing himself to be more complicated than his first impression suggested. He was not a man who wasted words on pleasantness, but he was fair in a way that she'd come to recognize. He didn't make promises he didn't keep, and he didn't revise his expectations without warning. When she asked him to approve spending on better quality lard, he said no. And when she explained her reasoning, citing the reduction in waste and the improvement in the bread that would follow, he said he'd think about it. 3 days later, the better quality lard appeared in the cold storage without comment. That was Haskell's version of being persuaded. She learned to work with it. And then there was Rhett Calloway. He remained the most difficult to read. He ate 3 times a day at the same place at the table, never complained, always cleared his plate. He worked. She could observe this much from the kitchen window, with a thoroughness that went beyond obligation, the way a man works when the work genuinely matters to him, not just as income, but as something else. He fixed things other men walked past. He was first out in the morning, and she couldn't always tell when he came in at night. He came to the kitchen door sometimes in the morning. Not every morning, but enough mornings that she stopped being startled by it. They would stand outside in the pre-dawn quiet and not say much, and she found that she'd stopped being uncomfortable with the silences. They had become something else, not quite companionable, but close enough that she could feel the shape of what they might eventually become. Once she said, "You know the rest of them think you're strange." He was quiet for a moment. "Do they?" Standing around at 5 in the morning staring at the sky, it concerns them. The not-quite smile appeared. "And you?" "I'm here too," she said. "So I suppose that makes 2 of us strange." He looked at her then, a longer look than he usually gave, and she had the feeling of being seen in the way she had become accustomed to not being seen, directly, without the usual glaze of judgment that served as a filter between her and most of the world's attention. "You're doing well," he said, "with the work. It's what I'm here to do. People don't always do what they're there to do." He looked back at the horizon. "I've seen enough of them to know." She thought about asking what he meant by that. She decided against it. Some things you let come in their own time, or they don't come at all. And either way, you've got biscuits to start. Toward the end of her 5th week, something happened that she hadn't anticipated, which was that she stopped thinking of the ranch as temporary. She'd been thinking of it as temporary from the moment she'd set out from Gideon's Creek, a position to hold until something else came along, a solution to the immediate problem of having $7.40 and nowhere obvious to put herself next. She had not allowed herself to think of it as anything more than that, because she knew better at 28 than to build attachments to things that could be taken away. But something in her 5th week shifted without her permission. She was making bread one afternoon, the rhythmic work of kneading, which she'd always found either meditative or tedious depending on the day, when she became aware that she was thinking about the coming spring. Whether the kitchen garden behind the main house could be expanded, whether she could grow her own herbs, which would improve the cooking and reduce the supply cost. Whether the range needed a new grate before summer, because the left side was showing its age, and if it failed in summer with all hands on the property, it would be a serious problem. These were not the thoughts of a person who believed she was temporary. She kept kneading and let the thought settle. It didn't comfort her exactly, and it didn't alarm her. It was just true, in the way that things sometimes become true before you've consciously decided to let them. She was still thinking about it when Red appeared in the kitchen doorway. Not the outside doors, mchich. the interior door that led from the main house's back corridor, which was unusual. He usually came through the yard. He had a cut on his right hand that he'd wrapped imperfectly in a piece of cloth that was already soaking through. He was holding it at an angle that suggested he was trying to decide whether it was serious enough to fuss about. "Sit down," she said. "It's fine. Sit down anyway. You're dripping on my clean floor." He looked at the floor. There was a small dark spot on the boards near his boot. He sat down in the chair nearest the door. She washed her hands, dried them, and found the clean cloth she kept for exactly this kind of situation, which was more common on a working ranch than people who didn't work ranches understood. She unwrapped his hand and looked at the cut. Long, not deep, the kind you get from wire, which was what she guessed from the clean edges. "Fencing," she said. "Yeah." She cleaned it, working efficiently, and he sat still with the particular stillness of a man who is choosing not to make a performance of pain. She could feel the tension in his hand under hers, controlled deliberately. "You should have Gil look at this," she said. "You're looking at it." "I'm a cook." "You're also doing a better job than Gil would." He paused. "I've seen Gil look at injuries. He mostly just tells people they'll live." "You will live," she said. "See?" She wrapped the hand properly, tied it off, and let go. He flexed his fingers experimentally, testing the wrap's give. "Thank you," he said. "It's nothing." "It isn't nothing." He was looking at her in that direct way he had. "You didn't have to do that." Somebody had to. A small silence. Outside, she could hear the ranch sound, the horses, the distant voices of men coming in from afternoon work, the rhythm of an ordinary day ending in the ordinary way. "Why did you come here?" he asked. "To this ranch." She looked at him. "Same reason anyone comes anywhere. I needed work." "A lot of places need cooks. This one had room and board." She went back to the bread, which needed another few minutes of kneading. "I needed the whole arrangement, not just the wages. I was down to what I could carry." She said it without apology, because there was nothing to apologize for, and she was tired of softening facts that were just facts. He was quiet for a moment. Most people wouldn't say that directly. Most people make a production of not saying things directly. I find it takes more energy than it's worth. "Yeah," he said. Something in his voice had changed slightly. A warmth that wasn't usually there, or that was usually kept at a temperature she couldn't detect. "I know what you mean." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Do you?" He stood up, favoring the wrapped hand naturally. "Dinner's going to be late if I'm keeping you from that bread." "It'll be on time," she said. "It's always on time." He almost smiled then, closer than usual, the expression getting within range of commitment. "I know," he said. "That's the thing, isn't it? It always is." He went back out the interior door, and she turned back to the bread. And outside, the light was going the way it went out here. Fast and orange and complete. The kind of dusk that didn't ease you into darkness but just arrived. She needed. She thought about spring. She thought about the kitchen garden. She thought about the way he'd said it always is. Like a man confirming something he'd already known for some time and hadn't quite found the occasion to name. She wasn't sure what to do with any of that yet. But the bread was going to be good, and dinner was going to be on time, and tomorrow morning she was going to be up at 4:30 to start again. That, at least, was settled. The kitchen garden was smaller than she'd hoped, and the soil was harder than it looked. She'd brought it up with Gil Haskell on a Thursday morning in early May, standing in the patch of ground behind the main house that got the most consistent sun, showing him where she thought the beds should go and what she intended to plant in them. He'd listened with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back the way he did when he was deciding whether something was worth arguing about. "You'd need to break that ground yourself," he said. "Men are too busy." "I know that. And seeds cost money. I have the supply budget numbers. I can show you the math on herb cost versus what we're spending in town. It's not close." He looked at the ground, then at her, then at the ground again. "Don't plant anything I can't name," he said, and walked away. She took that as approval. She spent her early mornings that week with a borrowed spade, breaking the compacted earth before the day's heat made it worse. It was brutal work on top of everything else. Her shoulders ached by the time she got to the kitchen, and her hands, already rough from the cooking, developed new complaints. She didn't mention it to anyone. There was no one to mention it to, and she wouldn't have anyway. What she hadn't expected was for anyone to notice. On the fourth morning, she was fighting a root system that had no intention of surrendering when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Rhett Calloway standing at the edge of the patch, looking at what she was doing with an expression that was hard to read. "You started this already," he said. "Somebody had to. I thought you said that about my hand." He walked closer, looked at the root she was wrestling with. Without asking, he crouched down beside it and got his fingers under the main root and pulled, and the thing came free with a sound like something tearing that had been holding a long time. He stood up and tossed it aside. His wrapped hand was healed by now. It had been 2 weeks, and he used it without thinking about it, which she took as a sign the bandaging had done its job. "Thank you," she said. "It's nothing." She almost smiled. He'd used her words back at her without appearing to realize it, or perhaps he had realized it, and that was the point. With Rhett Calloway, it was sometimes difficult to tell the difference between coincidence and intention. They worked in silence for 20 minutes, him pulling roots while she turned the broken soil, and neither of them said much because there wasn't much to say, and the work itself was a kind of conversation. When the patch was cleared enough to be worth planting, he stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. "You'll need to water it every other day," he said. "Ground dries fast out here." "I know." He nodded. He started to go, then stopped. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know." She looked at him. "I'm used to it." "That's not the same thing as it being necessary." She didn't have an answer for that, and he didn't wait for one. He went back around the main house toward wherever he'd been headed before the root stopped him, and she stood in the turned earth with the spade in her hands and thought about the difference between habit and necessity, which was a distinction she hadn't spent much time on before. She thought about it for the rest of the morning. It didn't resolve into anything useful, but it stayed with her. May brought with it a change in the work's rhythm and a change in the temperature of the ranch's social weather, not all of it in her favor. 3 new hands arrived in the middle of the month, seasonal hires for the fence repair work and cattle movement that the warmer season required. Their names were Hector, a quiet Mexican man who'd worked ranches from Texas to Montana, a lanky boy called August who couldn't have been more than 19, and a man named Graves who was somewhere between 40 and 50, and had the look of someone who'd made enough bad decisions in his life that they'd begun to show up in his face. Hector sat down at the table that first night, ate everything on his plate, looked up at Delilah when he was done and said, "That's the best beans I've had since Laredo." Simply, with no performance to it. She thanked him and meant it. August ate with the determined focus of a very hungry young man and didn't say much to anyone, though he thanked her when she refilled his coffee, and he had the kind of manners that suggested a mother somewhere had worked hard at instilling them before releasing him into the world. Graves was another matter. He sat at the far end of the table, and he ate with the look of someone conducting an inspection, and when he was done, he pushed his plate back and said to no one in particular, "Better than I expected from looking at the cook." He was looking at the table when he said it, not at her, which was the particular cowardice of the indirect insult, designed to land without leaving a traceable origin. The table went quiet for a moment. Clyde, at the other end, said, "You gonna talk or eat, Graves?" "I did both," Graves said. "That's what mouths are for." "Then you're done with one of them for the night." Another quiet. Graves picked up his coffee and said nothing more, and the table returned to its usual sounds, and Delilah took plates back to the kitchen and started on the washing. Her hands were steady. She'd had years of practice at keeping her hands steady. What bothered her wasn't Graves specifically. It was the fact that 3 new men meant 3 new sets of assumptions, and she'd been making progress. Slow, uneven progress, but real. And now she was starting from a reset position with part of the table. It was like building something and then having a section of the foundation shift. The walls don't come down, but you notice the tilt. She was still thinking about this when she realized Rhett had come into the kitchen. He didn't always do this. Mostly he kept to the common areas and the bunkhouse and the work. And the kitchen was her territory in a way that the rest of the ranch wasn't, and he seemed to understand that without being told. But tonight he came in, and he sat down in the chair by the door, the same chair where she'd wrapped his hand, and he didn't say anything immediately. She kept washing dishes. "Graves has worked ranches for 20 years, he said finally. "I figured." "He's not going to stop." "I know." "Clyde will keep running interference, but I don't need Clyde to run interference." She said it without heat, setting a plate on the drying rack. I need Clyde to stop drawing attention to it, actually. Every time someone defends me, it tells Graves that it's working. A pause. That's a particular way to look at it. It's the way that works. She picked up another plate. Men like Graves stop when they stop getting a reaction. Not before. The worst thing anyone can do is make it into an event. She could feel him looking at her, the particular quality of his attention that she'd learned to recognize over the past weeks. Not intrusive, not evaluative the way most attention felt, but genuinely considering what she'd said, turning it over. You've dealt with people like him before, he said. Haven't you? Another pause, different from the first one. Yeah, he said. I have. She dried her hands and turned around. He was looking at the floor now, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that was different from his usual self-containment. Not tension exactly, but proximity to something he wasn't going to discuss tonight. For what it's worth, he said, the food was good tonight. It's worth something, she said. Thank you. He got up and went out, and she turned back to the remaining dishes, and she thought about the way he'd said I have. Briefly, quietly, the way a person confirms something they'd rather not dwell on. June arrived with heat, and it arrived early. The work expanded with the season. More men working longer hours meant more mouths to feed at irregular times, which meant the kitchen schedule collapsed into something she managed in real time rather than against a fixed plan. Men came in from the far pasture at 2 p.m, starving, and there was no noon meal left. She'd learned to keep a pot going that could expand or contract, depending on who showed up and when. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, and working was what mattered. She also discovered that the ranch had financial pressure she hadn't been previously aware of. She found this out not from Gil Haskell, who told her what she needed to know for her work, and nothing additional, but from the conversations that happened in the bunkhouse that she could still hear through the wall, which remained thin. Third shipment they've held, she heard Clyde say one night. Market prices are down and they're holding the money until it comes back up, but we're the ones waiting on it. Whose call is that? Said another voice. Porter, maybe. Investors. People who own pieces of this thing from a distance. A pause. Management's got to figure something out before fall or we're going to see a different kind of headcount. She lay on her cot and processed this. Ranch finances were not her business, not directly. But she understood that the ripple from financial pressure would eventually reach the kitchen, because it always did. Tighter supply budget, fewer hands, more work per person. She started thinking about the menu differently that week, not cutting quality, but being more aggressive about what she could produce from less. More beans, more bread, more root vegetables, and less butchered meat when possible. Things that were filling and nutritious and cheaper per portion. She didn't tell anyone she was doing this. She just did it, and the food kept being good, and the supply costs came down by 9% over the next 3 weeks, which she knew because she tracked the numbers and Gil Haskell tracked them too. And one morning he handed her the supply ledger and pointed at the column she'd reduced and raised his eyebrow at her. Intention, she said. Carry on, he said, and handed the ledger back. She carried on. It was toward the end of June when the thing with Graves finally came to a head, and it happened not the way she'd expected, but in the way things usually do. Sideways, from a direction she hadn't been watching. August, the young one, had taken to coming to the kitchen door in the evening sometimes, not asking for anything, just standing in the way that young people stand when they're near something warm and domestic that they're missing from their lives. She'd started keeping a biscuit or a piece of cornbread back for him because he was 19 and always hungry, which was a condition of being 19 that no amount of ranch food fully addressed. One evening, Graves saw this. He saw her pass the biscuit to August at the kitchen door, saw August take it and mumble thanks, and something about this transaction apparently bothered him in a way she hadn't anticipated, because the next morning at breakfast he made a comment, not to August, not to her directly, but to the table at large in the carrying voice of a man who knows exactly how to calibrate volume. Funny how some people get extra biscuits, he said. Makes you wonder what they did to earn them. The implication was clear enough. The table registered it. August's face went dark red. Delilah was at the range and she heard it, and she set down what she was holding and she turned around. August is 19 years old, she said. He eats everything I put in front of him, and he's still hungry after. If you have concerns about extra biscuits, I'm happy to save one back for you too, Graves. You're welcome to ask. Graves smiled, which was worse than when he wasn't smiling. I didn't mean anything by it. I know you didn't, she said, which was the particular response to that particular sentence that left absolutely nothing for him to grab onto. She turned back to the range. The table was quiet for a moment, and then it moved on, the way tables do, and August stared at his plate until the color left his face, and Graves said nothing more. Later that morning, Rhett came past the kitchen while she was out in the garden doing the watering, and he said, without stopping his walk, "That was well handled." "I'm not sure it was handled," she said, pouring water from the can at the base of the thyme she'd planted. "It was just responded to." He did stop then, at the corner of the garden. "There's a difference? Handling implies I controlled the outcome. I just said what was true and hoped for the best." She moved to the next plant. "That's not the same thing." He considered this. Fair point. He looked at the garden. The green that had appeared in the beds over the past weeks, small but genuine. The herbs coming up in uneven lines the way things grow when you plant them in hard ground without enough water. "It's doing well," he said. "Better than I expected. The ground here is worse than it looks." "I know that now." She moved down the row. "It fought me for the first 2 weeks. Then it decided I wasn't going away and gave up a little." She heard something that was close enough to a laugh that she turned to look at him. It wasn't quite a laugh, more an exhale with warmth in it. But on Rhett Calloway's face, that was close enough to count. "That's one way to describe it," he said. "Do you have a better one?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "That one's pretty accurate." He went on past, and she went back to the watering, and the herbs grew in their crooked rows, and the ground continued to be harder than it looked. What? The thing she hadn't expected about earning respect, partial, provisional, contested, was how much more complicated it made everything. In her first weeks on the ranch, she had been invisible in the way that people who are evaluated and dismissed become invisible. They make a judgment, and then they stop looking, which meant she could move through the place with a certain freedom of being unobserved. Now she was observed, and the observation had a different quality to it, and while she knew intellectually that this was an improvement, it came with its own set of pressures. The men watched her now the way they watched each other, which is to say, they were tracking whether she'd hold up. Clyde openly, the way Clyde did everything. Hector with his quiet, particular attention. August with the straightforward admiration of someone who didn't have the social sophistication yet to disguise it. Even Graves, grudgingly and from a distance, though she suspected his tracking was for evidence of failure rather than signs of success. What surprised her was Haskell. By mid-July, the foreman was stopping by the kitchen, not just on supply days, but other times, occasionally, for no stated reason. He would stand in the doorway and look at what she was doing and sometimes say something and sometimes not. She had initially interpreted this as supervision, which would have been reasonable. But it wasn't supervision. The expression was wrong for supervision, too casual, too settled. One evening she said, "Is there something you need, Mr. Haskell?" He looked slightly surprised, like she'd pointed out something he hadn't realized he was doing. "No," he said, "just looking in." "At anything in particular?" He thought about this with more seriousness than the question probably deserved. "Keeping an eye on how things are running," he said finally. "That's my job." "Everything's running fine." "I know." He didn't move. "Your mother teach you to cook?" The question came from nowhere, in the way that the questions Gil Haskell asked occasionally emerged, sideways, with no apparent connection to what had just been said. "My mother couldn't cook," she said. "She told me that, and she was right. I taught myself mostly. Learned more from the boarding house cook in town, woman named Ida. She was particular about everything, and she had no patience, which was the best possible way to learn." "Particular how?" "Ratios, temperatures." She believed that sloppy measuring was a form of disrespect. Delilah turned the bread loaf out of its tin onto the rack. "I thought she was excessive about it for the first 6 months. Then I understood that she was right." Haskell was quiet for a moment. "My wife cooked like that," he said. It was said flatly, without sentimentality, the way a man reports something true that has a weight he isn't interested in performing publicly. "Particular about every detail. Drove me mad for 15 years and then—" He stopped himself. "Then I had to cook for myself for a while." She didn't ask. She waited. "Took me 3 months to figure out why the bread was wrong," he said. I was measuring by eye instead of by weight. 15 years of watching her, and I'd missed the most important thing. Delilah looked at him. He was looking at the bread on the rack. How long has she been gone? She asked. 7 years. He pushed off the doorframe. That's a reasonable loaf, he said, and left. She stood alone in the kitchen and understood something she hadn't before about Gil Haskell, which was that the kitchen wasn't just where the food was. For him, it was also where something had been, and coming in sometimes was its own complicated thing that had nothing to do with supervision. She didn't change anything about how she handled his visits. She just filed away what she'd learned and held it the way you hold things that belong to someone else, carefully and without using them. Madi. Rhett continued to be the person she understood least and thought about most, which was an inconvenient combination. She knew his work habits by now. He was out early and in late, and he worked across every part of the operation in a way that wasn't typical of someone with a fixed assignment. She'd noticed that he was always nearby when things went wrong, as if he had some instinct for it, and that his response to things going wrong was not to escalate but to solve, quietly, with a minimum of drama. A fence section down, and he was there with wire and tools before anyone else had organized. A horse throwing a shoe at the wrong moment, and Rhett was the one who'd already seen it and already handled it. She noticed other things, too. The way the men checked with him before they made certain decisions, even Haskell, though it was subtle. A glance, a slight pause before acting, a checking of Rhett's expression in the moment before consensus formed. She had seen Haskell do this, and Haskell was not a man who deferred to anyone lightly. She turned this over for several evenings without arriving anywhere useful. In the last week of July, she asked him about it directly, because that was what she did when indirect approaches were taking too long. They were at the kitchen door in the early morning, the fourth such morning that week, and it was dark enough still that she couldn't see his face clearly, just his outline against the lighter outline of the sky. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." The men check with you before they decide things. Even Haskell. A pause. She let it be a pause and didn't fill it. "I've been here a long time," he said. "I know how the place runs." "That's not it." Another pause. "No," he agreed. "It's not entirely it." "So what is it?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, which would also have been an answer of a kind. Then he said, "There are people who work a place and people who have a stake in a place. The men can tell the difference, even when they don't know the details." She absorbed this. "And you have a stake." "I do." "What kind of stake?" He didn't answer that one, and this time the pause wasn't the kind that was going to become something. It was the kind that ended a line of inquiry. She respected it, because she wasn't someone who pushed past the places where people chose to stop, and because some questions answered themselves in time if you were patient enough to let them. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. The sky lightened, as it always did out here with its particular speed and completeness. And she went back inside to start the coffee and the biscuits, and she thought about stakes and what they meant. And she thought about a man who'd lived among these people for a long time, watching who they were and what they did when things got hard. She thought about what she would see in that position, what she was probably already being seen doing in ways she didn't fully know. The coffee came to boil, and she poured the first cup and set it at the end of the counter, the spot where Rhett came in for his morning coffee before the others were up. And she thought that the question she'd asked and not gotten a full answer to was sitting somewhere between them now, like a stone in a field. Obvious, unmovable, something you worked around until the moment came when you finally decided to deal with it directly. That moment wasn't this morning, but it was coming. She could feel the shape of it, the way you can feel a change in weather before the weather arrives. She poured her own cup and drank it standing at the range, and the morning moved through its paces, and Callaway Ranch kept its secrets for another day. The stone she'd felt between them didn't move for another 3 weeks. August had turned into something oppressive, the heat sitting on the land like a hand pressing down, the kind of heat that made men irritable and slow and inclined toward short answers and shorter tempers. The kitchen was worse than anywhere else on the property because the range had to stay lit regardless, and by midday the room was at a temperature that would have discouraged most people from entering it. Delilah worked in it anyway because the food didn't cook itself, and she'd long since stopped keeping track of what was difficult and what wasn't. The new grate she'd flagged for Haskell in the spring had finally been ordered and installed in late July, which improved the range's performance and reduced the fuel it wasted. She'd noted the improvement in the supply ledger without comment, but Haskell had looked at the numbers and looked at her and given one of his abbreviated nods that served, in his economy, as genuine acknowledgement. Red had noticed the new grate, too. He'd come into the kitchen one morning to find her adjusting the damper, testing the draw, and he'd said, "Gil finally approved that." 3 months after I requested it, she said. "But yes, he takes his time." He takes everyone's time. The trick is not minding it. She adjusted the damper a fraction more. The trick with people like Haskell is to make the request and then make it easy to forget you made it. If he feels pressured, he digs in. If he feels like it was his own idea, he moves faster. Rhett was quiet for a moment. "You've got him figured out." "I've got people figured out. It's most of what I've had to work with." She stood back from the range, satisfied with the draw. "Some people figure out ranching. I figure out people." "Both useful," he said. "Yes," she said. "Both." He'd poured his coffee and gone out, and she'd watched him cross the yard through the kitchen window, and she'd thought again about the conversation from the pre-dawn dark 3 weeks ago, about steaks and what kind, and the place where the question stopped, the stone between them. Still there? Still unmoved. She had decided sometime in early August that she was not going to move it. Not because she wasn't curious, she was, consistently and inconveniently, but because she'd developed a belief that some things found their own moment, and forcing the moment rarely improved what you found there. She was right about that. She just hadn't counted on a storm making the decision for her. The weather changed on a Wednesday. She noticed it the way she'd learned to notice things out here, not by looking directly at the sky, which anyone could do, but by watching the animals. The horses in the corrals were restless in a particular way that was different from ordinary restlessness, moving against each other and against the fences, the sound of them different in register. The dogs that usually slept near the bunkhouse porch were nowhere she could find them. Clyde's horse, a usually steady animal, had refused the saddle that morning, and Clyde had spent 20 minutes on it before getting it done, arriving at breakfast late and out of temper. "Something's coming," she said to Haskell at the noon meal. He looked at her. Weather service out of Cheyenne said clear through the weekend. "I know what they said." She refilled his coffee. "Something's coming anyway." He looked out the window at the flat sky, which was still blue and gave nothing away. "I'll have the men check the fence lines this afternoon." She nodded and went back to the kitchen, and she spent the afternoon making sure the cold storage was properly secured and that she had enough dry goods above floor level to survive flooding if it came to that. She moved the flour and the cornmeal to the highest shelves. She checked the window latches in the kitchen. She filled every container she had with water. Rhett watched her do some of this, coming through the kitchen late in the afternoon for no stated reason, stopping when he saw what she was doing. "You think it's bad," he said. "I think I'd rather be wrong and prepared than right and not." He went out without another word, and she heard him, shortly after, talking to Haskell in the yard. And then she heard the changed note in Haskell's voice that meant he was taking something seriously. And then she heard the sound of men being directed with more urgency than the usual afternoon assigned. The storm came that night. It didn't announce itself the way a reasonable storm would have, building over hours, giving people time to finish what they were doing and get inside. It came in from the northwest hard and fast, and by the time the first real rain hit the windows, the wind was already high enough to be a problem. She heard the sound of something coming loose on the roof. A section of shingles, she thought, or possibly a piece of the chimney cap. And then the rain was coming down in a solid wall of sound, and the night outside the windows was entirely black. She had the range going and both lanterns lit, and she'd already put a pot of coffee on because she knew what was coming. What came was men. Clyde first, then August and Hector together, then 3 others, coming in wet and loud and bringing the storm in with them in the form of mud and cold water and the particular raw smell of men who have been outside in something serious. "Fence line on the east side is down," Clyde said, getting the words out before he'd fully cleared the doorway. 40 yards of it, maybe more. Cattle are already moving." "How many out?" she asked, because she understood already that this was information management as much as anything else. "Hard to say. Dark. Could be 30 head or could be 100. He was dripping on the kitchen floor and didn't seem to know it. Rhett and Haskell are still out there. How long? Since an hour ago. She poured coffee, 4 cups, because that was how many hands were in the kitchen, and she was already heating water for the next pot. Sit down and warm up. You're going back out. I know. Then sit down first. They sat. She fed them what she had ready. The soup that had been intended for dinner, cornbread, the last of the biscuits from that morning that she'd been keeping for exactly this kind of moment. She worked fast, not frantic, moving between the range and the table with a rhythm that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the practical reality that men going back out into a storm needed warm food in them, and there was no time to make a production of providing it. August, who was 19 and probably more frightened than he was showing, wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Harper." "Eat," she said. "Not quickly, properly." He ate properly. She was on her 4th pot of coffee when the door opened again and Rhett came in, and he was wet in a way she hadn't seen before, thoroughly, completely, the kind of wet that happens when you've been outside in something violent for an extended period without meaningful shelter. There was mud on one side of his face, and his right sleeve was torn from the shoulder seam, and he was holding his left arm at an angle that made her stomach turn over. "Sit down," she said. "Sit down first." He sat down. The other men registered his state and registered her tone, and nobody said anything, which was the right call. She came to him with the lantern and looked at the arm. He dislocated his shoulder. She was almost certain of it. The angle was wrong. The deliberate way he was holding it was the way a man holds something that he's discovered hurts worse when it moves. She'd seen this before once, when a man at the boarding house had fallen from a second-floor window during a particularly poor decision. The boarding house doctor had put it back. "When did this happen?" she asked. "About 40 minutes ago." His voice was steady, which was an achievement given what she was looking at. "Haskell?" "He's okay." He went around the north side with Porter and Dutch to head off the cattle. He looked at her. "I'm fine." "Your shoulder is out of socket." "I know what it is." "Do you know that I've seen this fixed before?" A pause. His jaw tightened slightly. "Have you done it?" "No. But I watched it done twice, and the doctor explained what he was doing while he did it." She didn't add that she'd read about it afterward, in a medical guide she'd found at a bookseller in Gideon's Creek 2 years ago, bought out of the same general instinct for useful information that had served her throughout her life. This was probably not the moment for that particular detail. "It's going to hurt." "More than this?" "Yes." "For a moment?" "Then less." He looked at her for a long moment. His face was wet and tired, and the mud on his cheek was starting to dry at the edges, and he was in real pain. She could see that even through his very practiced effort to not be visibly in it. "All right," he said. "Clyde," she said, without looking away from Rhett. "Come hold him." "I don't need," Rhett started. "It's not for you," she said. "It's so I have both hands free." Clyde came and stood behind Rhett's chair and put his hands on his shoulders, the good one firmly, the displaced one lightly. And she positioned herself in the way she remembered the doctor positioning himself, and she looked at Rhett one more time. "Don't brace against it," she said. "That makes it worse." "I know." "Then stop bracing." She felt him deliberately release some of the tension he'd been holding. It took him a real effort. She could see it in his face. She moved quickly and with more confidence than she entirely felt, and the joint went back with a sound and a sensation that she felt through her hands, and Rhett made a sound that was not quite a word and then went silent and still. She held his arm for a moment, steady, waiting. "Okay," he said after a pause. His voice was different. The deliberate steadiness was gone, replaced by something rawer and more real. "Okay, that's better. Move your fingers." He moved them. Good. She let go carefully and reached for the clean cloth she'd already put to hand. "I'm going to wrap it. You need to keep it still." "I know." The knowing and the doing are different things with shoulders. "Yeah." He looked up at her, and his face was open in a way it very rarely was. The control loosened by pain and relief, and the particular vulnerability that comes when someone has just done something for you that required trust you hadn't consciously decided to give. "Thank you." "You're welcome." She started rapping. "Don't thank me until you're sure I did it right." "I'm sure." "You can't be sure yet. Give it 20 minutes." He almost laughed, and this time it was closer to a real laugh than that exhale she'd seen before. Something that started in his chest and didn't quite make it all the way out, but nearly. "You're not going to let me just be grateful, are you?" "You can be grateful and also wait 20 minutes, she said. "Those two things can coexist." The storm lasted through that night and into the next morning, and it was as bad as the horses had known it would be. The east fence line was down in 3 sections, not 1. 11 head of cattle were scattered across 2 properties before the men got them turned, and 1 section of the bunkhouse roof developed a leak that had to be caught with buckets and managed through the night. The kitchen lost the window latch she'd tested and secured, and rain got in for about an hour before August, who was small enough to work in the tight space of the kitchen corner, figured out a temporary fix with rope and a piece of wood that held until morning. She ran the kitchen on no sleep and managed it. She kept coffee and food going through the night, working in shifts the way the men worked, making a batch, resting for an hour in the chair by the door, getting up and starting the next one. By 4 in the morning, she had fed every man on the property at least twice. She'd used nearly all the flour and most of the salt pork and all of the eggs, and she'd have to reorganize the supply order significantly. But that was a tomorrow problem, and tomorrow was several hours away. Rhett came in 3 times during the night. The first time to check the arm, which was holding. The second time to tell her that the east cattle had been recovered, mostly, and that the count looked like 7 missing, not 11. The third time was around 3 in the morning, and he didn't have operational news. He just came in and sat down in his chair, and she poured him coffee and sat down across from him in the other chair she'd pulled to the range for warmth, and they were both too tired to perform anything and too alert to sleep. 7 head, she said. 7. Could have been worse. Bunkhouse roof? Fixable. The leak didn't get into the walls. He drank his coffee. His shoulder was wrapped and resting, and he was managing it with varying degrees of success. She could see him reaching for things with his left hand and checking himself and using his right instead, the correction becoming more automatic as the night wore on. "Haskell's going to have a lot to manage after this," she said. "Yes. The fence repair alone? I know." She looked at him. He was looking at the range, the way he looked at the horizon in the mornings. Not seeing it exactly, seeing past it. His face in the lantern light was tired, and something else, some consideration that had moved in behind the tiredness and was working through him quietly. "Rhett," she said. He looked at her. "What is it?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to do what he did sometimes, redirect, say something adjacent rather than direct, let the question settle without answering it. But he didn't, this time. He set his coffee cup down on his knee, and he looked at her directly and he said, "There are things about this place that I haven't told you." She waited. "About who I am, in relation to this place." "All right," she said. "The steak I mentioned, the kind of steak." He paused. "I own this ranch, Delilah." She didn't say anything. "I've owned it for 6 years, since my father died and left it." He wasn't looking away from her, which she recognized as an effort. "The men don't know. Haskell does. He has to, for the legal side of things. But I made him agree to keep it between us when I first came back." She heard the word came back and filed it away. "Why?" she said. "Why not just be the owner?" "Because I'd been away for 4 years before that. School, then business in the East, then other things." He stopped himself on that and moved past it. "When I came back, I didn't know who these men were. Which of them were worth trusting? Which ones were working this place with any real care, and which ones were just drawing wages and waiting for something better? You can't know that if they know you can fire them. They perform. The performance tells you nothing." She thought about this carefully. "So you made yourself a ranch hand?" "Yes." "To watch. To learn." He shifted in the chair, adjusted his arm. I know how it sounds. Manipulative. Like I was running an experiment on people who didn't know they were in one. Was that what it was? He looked at her. "Partly," he said, and she appreciated that he didn't reach for a cleaner version of the truth. "I told myself it was necessary, and I still think it was necessary, but yes. There's a manipulation in it that I can't argue away." She sat with this. The fire in the range shifted, settling lower, and she reached over and adjusted the damper without standing up. A small mechanical action that gave her hands something to do while her mind worked. How long did you plan to keep it going? She said. I don't know. The plan wasn't very detailed on that end. He looked at the floor. I kept waiting for a clear moment. A moment when I knew what I knew and could move forward from it. But the moments I got were complicated. Complicated how? A pause. People are more than they look like from the outside. I already knew that, in theory. I didn't expect to keep finding it out. He picked up his coffee again. Hector Clyde. August, who is going to be something impressive in about 5 years if he stays with it. He stopped. You. She held very still. I was not prepared for you, he said, which was said simply, without elaboration, in the way he said things that were true and that he'd decided to say directly. I thought I was watching a cook, someone who would either hold up or wouldn't. I did not expect... He paused, searching, and she watched him not find the word he wanted, settle for a different one, everything else. The fire was low now and the lantern was the primary light, and the storm was still present outside the windows, but at a lower register, the worst of it passed. The ranch was quiet in the particular way a place gets quiet after something hard has moved through it. Not peaceful exactly, but released. She looked at him across the chair backs and the space between them, and she said, You lied to me. Yes. Not directly, but by omission, for months. Yes. Every conversation we've had, every morning at the kitchen door, she stopped herself. You knew things about this situation that I didn't know, and you chose not to tell me. Yes? He didn't flinch from it, and he didn't add qualifiers. That's true. She stood up. She went to the range and added wood to it because it needed it, and because she needed the movement. She stood with her back to him for a moment and looked at the fire through the grate and felt the warmth of it on her face and thought about what she was feeling, which was not entirely what she'd expected. She was angry. But underneath the anger was something older than the anger, something she recognized as the particular feeling of being watched without your knowledge, of being seen in all the ways you are actually yourself because you didn't know to perform, and now discovering that observation and having to decide what to do with it. Did anything change, she said, still facing the range, when you watched me? Did you learn anything you didn't already know you wanted to find? A long pause, long enough that it was its own kind of answer. Yes, he said. She turned around. What? He met her eyes. In the low light, his face was bare of its usual containment, the control worn down by the night's events into something more unfinished and more real. That courage isn't a loud thing, he said, and that I'd been looking for it in the wrong places. She held his gaze and he held hers, and the night moved around them and neither of them looked away. I'm angry with you, she said. I know. I don't know yet whether I'll stay angry. That's fair? It's not fair, she said. Fair has nothing to do with it. It's just the truth. She sat back down in her chair. I'm going to stay through the storm. We're going to deal with the fence and the cattle and the roof. And when that's done, I need you to tell me what this place actually is and what you actually need from the people who work it. Not the performance of being a ranch hand. The actual truth. He was quiet for a moment. And then I'll decide what I think about it. She picked up her coffee, which had gone cold. I'm not promising anything beyond that. I know. He looked at her with that directness that she'd noticed from the first week, the quality of attention that was different from what she was used to. For what it's worth, everything I've told you about you has been true. There was no performance in that. She didn't answer immediately. She got up and put the coffee on to reheat and stood at the range again, and outside the storm moved through its final acts, and the horses in the corrals were quieter now, and August's rope and wood fix on the window held through the rest of the night. I know, she said finally, which was not absolution and not forgiveness and not a resolution, but was what was true. And truth was what she had to start from. Morning came the way it always did out here, fast and without apology. The damage in daylight was worse than the darkness had made it possible to fully assess. The east fence wasn't 3 sections down. It was closer to 5, with 2 posts sheared off at the ground and 1 section folded over on itself in a way that suggested the wind had gotten under it and used it like a wing. The bunkhouse roof had lost shingles in a long strip along the south side. One of the outbuildings had a wall that had bowed visibly and would need to be properly assessed before anyone used it. And 7 cattle were still missing, somewhere to the east across the property line, which meant a conversation with a neighbor that was unlikely to be entirely pleasant. Haskell surveyed all of this standing next to Rhett in the yard, while Delilah watched from the kitchen window, and she could read the conversation from their postures even without hearing the words. Haskell's tight and specific and focused on the immediate. Rhett's broader, more expansive, the posture of a man thinking in terms of the whole rather than the parts. And then she saw the moment when Haskell stopped managing and started deferring. It was a subtle thing, a slight shift in how he was standing, a turning of his body that was about 3 degrees toward Rhett rather than facing him straight on, a gesture of his hand that deferred rather than directed. She had seen Haskell direct men for 5 months, and she knew how he held himself when he was in charge. And this was different, and the difference was unmistakable. Everything Rhett had told her the night before settled into its final shape. The men came out of the bunkhouse in varying states of sleep-deprived disarray, and she put breakfast on the table, and they ate with the appetite of people who'd been up most of the night doing physical work in difficult conditions. Nobody talked much. Graves actually looked subdued, which was not an expression she associated with him, and it occurred to her that nothing equalizes people quite like a serious storm. Everyone reduced to the same wet, tired, slightly shaken baseline. August had a cut above his eyebrow she hadn't noticed in the dark. She caught him after breakfast and looked at it, cleaned it, and closed it with the butterfly closure she kept in the first aid kit she'd assembled in her first month on the ranch, buying the components out of her own wages in small amounts over several weeks. He sat still and let her work and afterwards said, with his careful manners, "I fixed your window, by the way. Proper fix this morning, not just the rope." "I saw," she said. "Thank you." "It's nothing," he said, with a flicker of the not-quite smile she'd seen on Rhett's face months ago, and she realized the phrase had migrated through the kitchen's small gravity. Her words, Rhett's echo, now August's. Things spread in enclosed places, whether you intended them to or not. Rhett found her in the kitchen that afternoon when the day had settled into the exhausted business of damage assessment and repair planning. She was reorganizing the stores, figuring out what the storm had cost her in terms of supplies and what she'd need to reorder, the arithmetic of a kitchen that had run hard through an emergency and now needed to be rebuilt. He stood in the doorway, the inside doorway, the one that connected the kitchen to the rest of the main house, which she'd noted was the one he used when what he had to say was more private. "I'm going to tell the men," he said, "before the week is out, who I am." She looked up from the ledger. "Why now?" "Because this—" He gestured toward the window, toward the yard beyond it, the damaged fences and the battered outbuildings and everything that needed doing, "is going to require decisions that I can't make invisibly anymore. The fence repair, the missing cattle, the bunkhouse roof. There are cost decisions involved, things I need to authorize directly." He paused. "And because the reason I was hiding it stopped being fully sufficient some time ago." She held his gaze. "When did it stop being sufficient?" He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he said, "I want you to know, before I tell them, that your position here isn't contingent on anything other than the work. The wages stand, the room stands. Whatever is between us or isn't between us has nothing to do with the employment." She felt something move through her that was partly relief and partly irritation at herself for needing the reassurance she hadn't fully known she was carrying. "I didn't ask." "I know you didn't. I'm telling you anyway." He looked at her steadily. "I don't want you to have a question about that, even in the back of your mind somewhere." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the sounds of men working, the specific sounds of a place pulling itself together after something had tried to take it apart. "Tell them," she said. "The sooner the better." He nodded. He started to go, and she turned back to the ledger, and then she stopped, because something had been sitting in her since the night before, and she hadn't said it, and she thought she should. "Rhett." He stopped. "What you said last night," she said, not looking up from the ledger. "About courage, and looking for it in the wrong places." She paused. "I heard that." A silence. "I know you did," he said. She heard him go, his footsteps moving through the corridor toward the front of the house. And she sat in the kitchen with her ledger and her disrupted supplies, and the sound of the ranch beginning the slow work of repair, and she thought about a stone in a field, About the moment you finally stop working around it, the moment you decide to deal with it directly. She thought they were arriving at it. Not there yet, but close enough that she could see the shape of it clearly for the first time. She turned a page in the ledger and started the next column of numbers and let the rest sit where it was, because some things needed their own time, and she'd learned, more than most, the particular discipline of not rushing the things that mattered. Rhett told them on a Friday. He chose the evening meal, which was the one time all 15 men were in the same room at the same time, and he waited until the plates were mostly cleared and the coffee was poured, and the particular slouched ease of men who'd worked hard and eaten well had settled over the table. Delilah was at the range with her back to the room, washing the first round of cookware, and she heard the change in his voice before she fully registered the words, the slight elevation of register that meant he was speaking to the room rather than to the person beside him. "I need to say something to all of you," he said. The table noise dropped. She kept washing. Her hands moved slowly, careful not to make sound. "My name is Rhett Calloway. Most of you know that. What you don't know is that this ranch, the land, the operation, the cattle, all of it, belongs to me. It has for 6 years since my father died." He paused. "I've been working beside you as a hand because I chose to, because I wanted to know this place and the people on it before I made decisions about either. That's the truth of it, and I'm not going to dress it up." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. Not stunned exactly, but recalibrating. She heard the sound of a cup set down on the table. Someone shifted in their chair. Clyde's voice, careful and unhurried. "How long has Haskell known?" "Since before any of you arrived." Another pause. She could feel the temperature of the room changing, the way a room changes when people are processing something and haven't decided yet what they think about it. Porter said, "So you were watching us?" "Yes." "That's—" Porter stopped. Started again. "That doesn't sit right with me." "I understand that," Rhett said. "I'm not asking you to be comfortable with it. I'm telling you the truth because the situation requires it and because you've earned it." Graves, from the far end of the table, said nothing. She heard him, or rather she heard the absence of him. The particular quality of Graves's silence, which was never empty but always working. August said quietly, "Does it change anything about the work?" "No," Rhett said. "Wages are the same. Haskell runs the day-to-day the same as he always has. What changes is that decisions about the ranch's future get made openly now. I'm done with the other way of doing it." Hector said something in Spanish, low, that she didn't catch. Then in English, "You did the same work as any of us, every day." A pause. "I've seen bosses. You worked like a man who gives a damn. That's not nothing." The silence shifted again. It not resolved, but moved a degree or two towards something less charged. Clyde said, "I've got questions." "I expect you do," Rhett said. "Tonight or tomorrow, whichever you'd rather." "Tomorrow. I need to sit with this first." "Fair enough." The table began to break up in the irregular way it did after meals, men moving at their own pace, some lingering over coffee, some heading directly for the door. She heard the sounds of chairs and boots and the low murmur of private conversations that she made no effort to follow. She kept her hands in the wash water and let the room empty around her. When it was quiet enough that she believed she was alone, Graves's voice came from somewhere close behind her, and she kept herself from startling by will alone. "You knew," he said. It wasn't a question. She turned around. He was standing near the kitchen doorway, his hat in his hands, which was the first time she'd seen him hold his hat rather than wear it indoors. His expression was complicated, not hostile for once, something harder to name. "He told me during the storm," she said. "Not before." Graves looked at her for a long moment. He had the eyes of a man who'd spent a long time assessing people for risk, and she'd felt those eyes on her since the day he'd arrived, and they had never felt neutral. But tonight they were doing something different. Tonight, they were just looking. "Huh," he said. He put his hat back on. "That's interesting." He went out. She stood in the kitchen and thought that she still didn't like Graves, and that she had a feeling, dim and unformed, that she hadn't seen the end of him. The days following Rhett's disclosure had the particular texture of a place adjusting to a shift in its own gravity. Nothing changed dramatically. The work was the same work. Fence repair continued. The bunkhouse roof got its shingles replaced over 3 days of careful labor. The 7 missing cattle were recovered through a negotiation with the neighboring alderman property that cost 2 fence posts and a dinner that Delilah cooked and sent over in covered dishes with August as the delivery. Haskell continued to run the daily operation with the same tight economy he'd always used, and if anything, the men seemed to take his direction more seriously, not less, as though knowing the structure they were working within made the work itself more legible. But the texture was different. Rhett moved through the ranch differently. Not dramatically so, but with a slight relaxation of the containment he'd always carried. The way a person releases tension they've been holding so long they'd stopped noticing it. He talked more at meals. He asked questions at the table that weren't purely operational, about where men were from, what they'd done before, where they thought they might go. He was not transformed into a different person. He was still fundamentally private, still economical with words, still the man who found the fence section no one else had gotten to yet. But the layer of deliberate concealment was gone, and the difference it made was real. With Delilah, it was more complicated. She was angry with him. She'd said that plainly, and she'd meant it. And the anger was still there 5 days later, a low, persistent thing that she moved around in her daily work the way she moved around the furniture she'd learned the position of by now. She wasn't dramatic about it because drama wasn't her way. But it was there. What complicated the anger was that she kept understanding him better the more she thought about it. And understanding someone is not the same as forgiving them, but it gets in the way of staying cleanly angry, which she found inconvenient. He had done what he'd done because he genuinely believed he needed to. She could follow the logic. It was not the logic of a careless man or a cruel one. It was the logic of a man who had been burned by the difference between what people presented and what they were, and who had devised a costly and imperfect solution to that problem. It was manipulative. It was also understandable. Both things were true and they didn't cancel each other out. She thought about this while kneading bread on a Tuesday morning, which was where she did most of her serious thinking, and she arrived at the same place she kept arriving at. She was angry about the method, but she believed in the person. She wished she could be more straightforwardly indignant. It would have been simpler. Rhett, to his credit, did not try to manage her through it. He did not attempt additional explanations or preemptive apologies or the kind of careful handling that some men resorted to when they'd done something wrong and wanted to accelerate the other person's recovery. He gave her space. He was present at the morning door. Some mornings, not all. And when he was there, he was simply there. And they talked about what they talked about: the ranch, the day's weather, the particular problem of the South Pasture's drainage that had been on the repair list for 2 months. He did not press on anything that she wasn't pressing on herself. She found toward the end of the first week that she was grateful for this more than she'd expected. On the 8th day after the storm, she was in the kitchen garden doing the evening watering. The herbs had come through the storm battered but not dead, which she'd taken as a reasonable metaphor for most things she cared about. When he came around the corner of the main house and stopped at the garden's edge in the way he sometimes did. "How is it?" he asked, meaning the garden. "Survived," she said. "The thyme looked terrible for 3 days. Came back. Thyme usually does." "I didn't know that." "It's a stubborn plant," he said. "Hard to kill if it's had time to establish." She looked at the thyme, which was in fact looking better than it had any right to look given what it had been through. "I want to talk to you," she said. "Not now. After dinner." "All right." He went on past, and she finished the watering, and she thought through what she needed to say in the way she thought through things she needed to say, not scripting it, because scripted conversation was always visible as scripted and fell apart at the first unexpected response, but identifying the true center of it, the thing she actually needed him to understand. She found it by the time she went back inside. It was simpler than she'd expected, which was usually how it went. After dinner, the table cleared, Haskell gone. The men dispersed to the bunkhouse in the usual evening drift. She and Rhett sat at the kitchen table. Not at the range, not with her working while he watched. At the table, across from each other, which was a thing they hadn't done before. And the formality of it was intentional on her part. She had 2 cups of coffee. She put one in front of him and one in front of herself, and she sat down. "When I came to this ranch," she said, "I had $7.40. I'd been let go from the last job I had for a reason that had nothing to do with my cooking and everything to do with the way other people decided to see me." She held the coffee cup with both hands. "I've spent most of my life being assessed before I was known. You understand what that means? Not the idea of it. I mean the daily actual reality of it. Walking into a room and already knowing what people have decided before you've opened your mouth. He was listening. Not preparing his response, actually listening, which she'd learned to tell the difference between. What you did, working among your men to see them clearly, I understand the purpose of it. I do. But what you also did, without intending to, was put me in a position where I was being watched and assessed in the same way I've been watched and assessed my whole life, without my knowledge, without my ability to know that's what was happening. She paused. I know that wasn't your intent, but that's what it was. He held the cup. He was quiet. The difference, she said, between what was done to me in town my whole life and what you did here, the difference is that you were looking for something real, and they were looking for confirmation of what they'd already decided. I know that. I can see the difference. She looked at him. But the not knowing, the being observed without consenting to be observed, that part was the same, and that part is what sits in me. He set the cup down. He looked at the table for a moment and then at her. You're right, he said. He didn't add anything to it. No qualification, no pivot to his own perspective, no explanation of what he'd been trying to accomplish that softened it. Just those two words, level and direct. She let them be there. I didn't consider it from that angle, he said after a moment. I should have. The fact that I didn't tells me something about what I was still missing, even at the end of 6 years of trying to see clearly. He paused. I'm sorry for it. Not for what I found. I can't be sorry for that, but for the method and what it cost you without your knowledge. She looked at him across the table, across the 2 cups and the evening quiet of the kitchen. Outside the windows, the light was going in that quick way it had, the orange compressing into dark, and the ranch was settling into its night sounds. I accept that, she said. It was not the same thing as everything being resolved, and they both knew it, and neither of them tried to make it into more than it was. Can I tell you what I actually found, he said, when I was watching? Not to justify it, just because I think you should know. She nodded. He leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the table. The first week you were here, I watched you work in a kitchen that was a wreck and make something out of it before noon on your first day. I watched you hear men laughing about you through the bunkhouse wall. I knew they were doing that. I could hear it too. And get up the next morning and do the same work better than the day before. He paused. I watched you figure out Haskell in about 3 weeks. I've worked alongside that man for 2 years, and I hadn't fully worked him out. You had him in a month, and you handled him like someone who'd been doing it for years. She said nothing. I watched you with the garden, with August, with Clyde. I watched you absorb graves and not break and not harden either, which is harder than either of those. He looked at her steadily. I watched you put my shoulder back in its socket in the middle of a storm with your hands absolutely steady. They weren't absolutely steady, she said. They looked it. The looking is something you practice. I know, he said. That's what I mean. He sat back slightly. You have built, out of necessity, out of years of having to, a set of capabilities that most people never develop because they don't have to, and you have done it without becoming bitter about the reason they were necessary. He paused. I don't know how you did that last part. I'm not sure I could have. She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen held the warmth of the day's cooking, the low fire still in the range, the smell of the herbs she'd brought in from the garden, drying on the shelf. You become what you practice, she said finally. I practiced endurance, and it became just how I am. I didn't set out to be patient. I set out to survive. Patience was what survival required. She looked at him. It's not a virtue when it starts that way. It's just adaptation. Maybe, he said. But you get to keep it either way. Where it came from doesn't change what it is now. She thought about this. It was not a thought she'd had before, framed that way, and it settled into a place in her that was unused to having things settle there. What happens now? She said. With the ranch. He recognized the shift, from the personal to the practical, and moved with it. The investors I mentioned, the ones holding the payment on the cattle shipment, that situation hasn't resolved. If the market doesn't move by October, I'm looking at a cash flow problem that will affect wages, the repair work, all of it. He was matter-of-fact about it, the way he was matter-of-fact about most things. I've been managing it without saying anything to the men because I didn't want speculation taking hold. But I need to address it properly, not just manage it quietly. What would addressing it properly look like? Part of it is diversification. We're too dependent on one revenue stream, cattle to one buyer network, one bad market cycle, and we're exposed. He looked at the table. I've been thinking about a secondary operation, something that can run alongside the cattle work without overwhelming the labor capacity. She considered this. What kind of secondary operation? That's where I run out of answer, he said. The land has capacity. The labor has gaps in the winter months when the cattle work drops off. But I haven't landed on the right. He stopped. She was already thinking. She'd been thinking about the supply runs, the $11 a month she spent on herbs that she was now growing for almost nothing, the quality of the soil in the lower field that Haskell had mentioned as problematic for grazing, but that she'd looked at with a different question in mind. She'd been thinking about the conversations in Gideon's Creek on supply days, the boarding house that served 20 guests and paid through the nose for dried goods it could have grown, the general store that imported things from Cheyenne that any decent kitchen garden could produce locally. The lower field, she said. He looked at her. What about it? It's wrong for cattle, the drainage is poor and the grass is thin, but the soil in the low drainage areas is dark, heavy. It's been collecting runoff and organic matter from the upper pasture for years. She paused. That's growing soil, not grazing soil. A proper kitchen garden, not a small one like I've got behind the house, but a real one, half an acre or more, would produce enough by the second season to supply the boarding house in Gideon's Creek, the general store's dry goods section, maybe the hotel at Clearwater if you wanted to go that far. He was very still. You've been thinking about this. I think about supply costs. It follows naturally. How long have you been thinking about it? Since May, she said. When I put the herb garden in and ran the numbers on what it saved. He looked at her across the table with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the warmth she'd come to recognize, not the particular attention she'd learned was his version of care, but something sharper and more startled, the look of a man encountering an answer in a place he hadn't thought to look. You have the numbers, he said. In my head. I'd want to write them out properly before presenting them to anyone. Present them to me first. I intended to. She picked up her coffee. It would need a real investment in the first season. Materials, seed, a proper irrigation channel from the upper pasture. Second season, it starts returning. By the third season, depending on what you can contract in town, how much investment? She gave him the number. It was not a small number, and she said it plainly because she didn't know how to be otherwise. He didn't flinch. He sat with it for a moment, running whatever calculations he ran. What's the return estimate? Third season? She gave him that number too. He looked at her. You've been carrying this since May, he said. I didn't know if it was my place to bring it. Something moved across his face. He recognized what she was saying and what it cost her to say it. The particular discipline of knowing your own value and still not knowing, in a new situation, how much of it you were allowed to show. It's your place, he said. Whatever role you hold here, the thinking belongs to you and the ranch benefits from it. Those two things don't have to be complicated. She looked at him steadily. They've always been complicated for me. I know, he said. I'm telling you they don't have to be, not here. He paused. Not with me. The room was quiet. Outside, someone in the bunkhouse had a harmonica, or an imitation of one, a thin, imprecise sound that carried through the evening air and then stopped, as if the player had thought better of continuing. She set her cup down. I'm going to write the numbers out tomorrow, she said, properly, with the projections and the cost breakdown. I'll look at them when you're ready. You'll have questions. Almost certainly. Good, she said. Questions I can answer. She stood and started to clear the cups, and he stood too, and for a moment they were both standing in the small kitchen space, and the proximity was not accidental, and they were both aware of it. Delilah, he said. She looked at him. He was close enough that she could see the place where the tiredness lived in his face, behind the eyes. The tiredness that came from years of carrying something without anyone to put it down with. She recognized it because it looked, in some ways, like the tiredness in her own face when she caught herself in a mirror. the specific exhaustion of people who had been largely alone with their own weight. "I see you," he said. Not as a preamble, not as a lead-in to something else, just that plainly in the voice he used for facts. She felt it land somewhere deep in her chest, in a place that had been waiting, she realized, for a very long time to receive exactly those words from someone who meant them without agenda. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked back at him and let herself be looked at, without the usual layer of prepared endurance, without the practiced steadiness, just as she actually was, tired and capable and complicated, and still there, after everything that had tried to convince her she shouldn't be. "I know you do," she said. It was quiet between them, not the silence that needed filling, but the other kind. The kind that meant something had been established and didn't need to be repeated. She took the cups to the basin. He moved to the door and she heard him stop. "The time will be useful," he said, "in the winter months. Dried herbs keep and the boarding house would pay well for them." She turned slightly. He was looking at the bundles drying on the shelf. "I know," she said. "That's why I planted twice as much as I needed." He was quiet for a moment. "You planned for this?" "From the beginning. I planned for what was possible. I didn't know yet what was possible here." She looked at the drying herbs. "I do now." He went out, and the evening completed itself the way evenings did. The dark coming in fully, the ranch settling, the harmonica attempting a second round in the bunkhouse and giving up again with slightly more finality. She cleaned the kitchen. She wrote the first numbers down from memory in the margin of the supply ledger, because they were clearest in her head tonight, and she didn't want to lose them to sleep. The numbers were good. She'd known they were good since May, and now she had a reason to say so. She worked until the fire in the range was down to coals, and the kitchen smelled of thyme and coffee and wood smoke, and she thought about what it meant, actually meant, in the bones of it, to be in a place where your thinking was wanted, where the person across the table didn't require you to be smaller to be present, where what you'd built out of necessity could finally be used for something other than survival. She thought it felt unfamiliar enough that she was going to have to practice it. She was prepared to do that. She turned off the lantern and went to bed and slept better than she had in weeks, though she would not have admitted that to anyone, and it wouldn't have mattered anyway because by the time anyone was up and moving, she was already at the range, coffee on, biscuits started, the numbers in the margin of the ledger waiting for morning. The numbers, written out properly, took her 3 evenings to complete, not because the arithmetic was difficult. She'd had the figures clear in her head since May, and they hadn't shifted, but because she wanted them right in the way that mattered for a man making a real decision with real money. Not approximate, not optimistic in the way that people's projections tend to be when they want something to work. She wanted them honest, which meant accounting for the bad seasons as well as the good, for the year the frost came early or the irrigation failed, for the market fluctuations she'd observed in the supply costs over 6 months of weekly runs to Gideon's Creek. She'd asked Haskell for the ranch's historical supply records on the second evening, and he'd given them to her without asking why, which was either trust or indifference, and she suspected it was something of both. When she was done, she had 4 pages in her careful hand. Not a presentation, just the truth of it, organized so a person who hadn't been thinking about it since May could follow the logic in a single sitting. She gave them to Rhett on a Thursday morning, across the kitchen table, with her coffee and his, the same configuration as the conversation 8 days before. He read them without speaking. All 4 pages, slowly, going back to the first one partway through to check something against a number on the third. She waited, which she was good at. He set them down. He looked at her. "The frost contingency," he said. "You built in 2 bad years out of 5. That's the regional average. I looked at the weather patterns recorded in the Gideon's Creek Courier going back 12 years, 2 significant early frosts per 5-year period, one of them severe." "Where did you find 12 years of the Courier?" "The post office keeps the archives. Mrs. Beaumont let me look through them on supply days. She thought I was doing it for personal interest." He was quiet for a moment. "Were you?" "I was doing it for this," she said. "I didn't know yet that I'd have an occasion to use it." He looked at the pages again. "The irrigation channel from the upper pasture. You put the cost at $40. I talked to Hector. He's dug irrigation channels before in Texas. He gave me the materials estimate. The labor would come from the winter slow period when the men are underworked anyway." You talked to Hector about this. I talked to Hector about digging. I didn't tell him what for. She paused. I didn't want to present it to anyone until I'd presented it to you. He looked at her across the table, and she could see him taking this in. Not the information, which he'd already absorbed, but the consideration behind it. The fact that she'd gathered what she needed without overstepping, without assuming access she hadn't been granted. It's good, he said. The plan is sound. The plan is cautious, she said. Sound and cautious are different things. I built it to survive the worst case, not to impress anyone. The worst case still returns 22% above cost by the third season. In the worst case, better than that in a normal year. He nodded slowly. I want to move on this before the ground hardens. Late September at the latest for the channel work. He picked up the pages. I'll need to settle the investor situation first. I need to know what capital I have available before I commit to the materials cost. How close are you to settling it? He set the pages down. There was something in his face that shifted, and she recognized it as the look of a thing he'd been managing and hadn't fully resolved. There's a meeting in Clearwater next week, he said. The investors want to see the ranch's books and hear my case for the cattle operations future. If they like what they hear, they release the held payment and we're in good shape. If they don't, he paused. If they don't? They have a right to buy out my position at assessed value. It's in the original agreement my father signed. He said it flatly, the way he said things that were difficult. If they exercise that right, this stops being my ranch. She absorbed this. When did you find out about that clause? When I read the agreement properly, 3 weeks ago. He looked at the table. I'd been operating on the assumption that my father's arrangement was straightforward. It wasn't. Why wasn't Haskell managing this? He didn't know about the clause either. My father didn't tell him. He looked up at her. The investors are a partnership based out of Denver. They've been patient because the operation has been profitable. But this year, with the market drop and the delayed payment, they're reconsidering. She sat with this for a moment. The kitchen was morning quiet around them, the coffee warm in her hands, the sound of men beginning to move in the bunkhouse filtering through the wall. Take me with you to Clearwater, she said. He looked at her. Why? Because you're going to walk into a room with men who have a legal claim over something you care about, and you're going to argue for it, and you're going to do it alone. She set her cup down. And because I've been dealing with people who've decided things before you open your mouth my entire life, and I know some things about that room that you might not. It's not that kind of meeting. Every meeting is that kind of meeting, she said. The room is full of men who have already decided what they think about the ranching operation, and about you. Your job is to move them off that position in about an hour. I've been doing a version of that every day for 28 years. She looked at him steadily. Take me with you. He held her gaze for a long moment. Outside, someone had started work on the fence line's last section. The rhythmic sound of a post-hole digger working through hard ground, steady and patient and persistent. All right, he said. The trouble with Graves happened 2 days before the Clearwater meeting, and it happened in the way that trouble with Graves was always going to happen, not as a confrontation, but as a slow leak, information finding its way out through the worst possible channel. She found out from August, who came to the kitchen door on a Tuesday afternoon with a look on his face that she'd learned to recognize as the look of a young man carrying something he'd rather not. You should know something, he said. Come in. He came in and stood near the door in his usual way, but didn't take the biscuit she kept for him. Graves was in Gideon's Creek on Sunday. He talks when he drinks, and he drinks when he's in town. August was choosing his words carefully. He was talking about Mr. Calloway, about the arrangement, about how the owner of the ranch had been pretending to be a hand, and about how... He stopped. About how what, August? He looked at the floor. About you. That you had the owner's ear, and maybe more than that. That things got easier for you around here for reasons that had nothing to do with the cooking. She stood very still for a moment. The kitchen held its usual smells. Coffee, bread cooling on the rack, the herbs drying on the shelf. And it all felt very solid and very ordinary against the specific unreality of hearing it said plainly. Who did he say this to? Whoever was at the bar. The bartender, some men she didn't know. I heard it from Clyde, who heard it from his cousin who was in there Sunday night. Does Rhett know? I don't think so, not yet. She nodded. Thank you for telling me. August looked at her, and in his 19-year-old face was something older than 19, a recognition of what was actually at stake, of how damage worked when it moved through a small community by word of mouth before the person it concerned even knew it was moving. "It's not right," he said. What he said. "People know you." "Some people know me," she said. "The ones who don't will hear the story first, which is the problem." She picked up the biscuit from its cloth and held it out to him. "Eat. You look like you've been sitting on that for a while." He took it, and she turned back to the range, and she thought clearly and without panic about what she was dealing with. Graves had not lied, technically. He had arranged the truth into a shape that implied something untrue, which was a more sophisticated form of damage than outright lying and harder to counter because there was nothing specific to refute. Yes, the owner had hired her. Yes, her situation had improved. Yes, she and Rhett spent time in conversation. The implication between those facts was Graves's addition, and implications didn't require evidence. She thought about what she would have said to herself years ago, sitting in a two-room house on the edge of Gideon's Creek with a reputation and no way to correct it. What she would have wanted someone to tell her. She thought, "You deal with it directly. You do not wait for it to resolve itself. You do not hope people will figure it out. You go to the room where the damage is happening and you stand in it and you say the thing that is true, clearly, without apology and without excessive explanation, and you let people decide." She told Rhett that evening. He listened. His face went through several things, none of them quiet, and he managed them all with the effort she recognized. When she was done, he said, "I'll speak to Graves." "What will you say to him?" "I'll terminate his employment." "On what grounds?" He looked at her. "On the grounds that he said something damaging and false." He didn't say anything false. He implied something false. There's a difference that a man like Graves understands very well. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, where they seemed to do most of their real talking. If you fire him the day after the story gets out, the story becomes that you fired him for talking. That confirms everything he implied. Rhett was quiet, working through it. She could see him not liking it. "So what do we do?" he said. "We go to Clearwater, we conduct the meeting, we come back, and the next supply run to Gideon's Creek. I go myself, and I stop at the boarding house and the general store, and I talk to the people who matter in that town about the kitchen garden plan, directly, as the person who developed it and who is going to run it." She held his gaze. "Graves told a story where I am a woman who earned her position through personal connection. I'm going to tell a different story where I am a woman who developed a business plan that will affect the local supply economy. Both stories have me in them. I get to decide which one people remember." He looked at her for a long moment. "And Graves?" "Graves is going to find that the targets he chooses say something about him, and eventually enough people notice." She paused. "But that's not my job. My job is to make the true story loud enough that the other one doesn't have room." Rhett was quiet. He was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before, in the kitchen during the storm, across the table in the conversations that had changed things between them, the expression of a man being surprised by someone he thought he'd already understood. "You've thought about this more than I have," he said. "I've had more practice with this kind of problem than you have," she said. "That's not a criticism. It's just true." He nodded. He sat with it. Then, "After Clearwater, after you go to town, what does Graves do then?" "After Clearwater," she said, "you can make whatever employment decision you want to make, but let it be clean. Let it be about his work, which has been adequate but not outstanding, and let it have nothing to do with Sunday night. The timing will be its own argument." He looked at the table. "I hate this," he said. "I know." "It's not fair to you." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She didn't dress that up. "But fair is not the operating condition out here. You know that as well as I do. You work with what's real." He looked up at her. "Is that how you've done it? All of it? You just work with what's real?" She thought about this seriously, because he was asking seriously. "I stopped waiting for fair a long time ago," she said. "Not because I stopped believing it mattered, but because waiting for it was using time I needed for other things." She paused. "You work with what's real. And then sometimes, if you've been patient long enough and strategic enough and you haven't quit, the real thing changes." He held her gaze. The kitchen was warm and the evening was going, and somewhere on the ranch the last of the summer was making its argument against the coming change of season. The particular fullness of the land in August when everything is alive and none of it knows yet that it won't last. Let's get through clear water, she said. Yes, he said. Let's get through clear water. The investors were 3 men, which was 2 more than she'd expected, and they sat on one side of a long table in the back room of the Clearwater Land Trust office, with the expressions of men who'd made their decisions before the meeting started and were present as a formality. She recognized this. She'd been in rooms like this her whole life, wearing different faces. Rhett sat across from them with Haskell to his left and Delilah to his right, which had caused the lead investor, a man named Cordell, silver-haired and dry, to look at her with polite confusion when they'd entered. "This is Delilah Harper," Rhett said, without elaboration. "She manages the ranch's kitchen operation, and she'll be presenting a secondary revenue proposal as part of today's discussion." Cordell's polite confusion didn't resolve into anything warmer, but he gestured for them to sit and the meeting began. Rhett presented the cattle operations numbers first, the year's performance, the market conditions that had caused the payment delay, the recovery trajectory he was projecting for the fall market based on current buyer correspondence. He was clear and factual and precise, and Delilah watched the investors take notes without showing what they were writing, which meant they were interested but unwilling to signal it. The second investor, a man called Marsh, who had the look of someone who did the detailed work while Cordell did the pronouncements, asked 3 specific questions about the operation's debt structure, and Rhett answered them all directly and without hedging. The third investor said nothing, which she decided meant he'd already formed a view and didn't need more information. Cordell said, "The storm damage in August, you've characterized this as manageable. The assessment? Fence repair is 60% complete," Rhett said. "Bunkhouse roof is done. 7 head recovered from the neighboring property. Net impact on the season's count is within the normal variation range. I have the figures here." Cordell looked at the page. "Your foreman put this together?" "No," Rhett said. "Delilah did." Cordell looked at her for the first time with real attention. She looked back and didn't arrange her face into anything particular. Not deference, not defensiveness, just the ordinary expression of someone sitting at a table where they belong. "You keep the ranch's financial records?" Cordell said. "I manage the kitchen budget and track supply costs. I also prepared the damage assessment because I had the numbers from the storm period. I was coordinating supply and food management through the crisis." She paused. "The figures in front of you are accurate. I can walk you through the methodology if that's useful." A brief silence. Marsh said, "That would be useful, actually." She walked them through it. She did not do it quickly to demonstrate efficiency or slowly to demonstrate thoroughness. She did it at the pace the material required, answering questions as they came, correcting a misreading of the cattle count column that Marsh had made, and doing so without making him feel corrected. When she was done, Cordell looked at Rhett and then back at her. "And the secondary proposal," he said. She presented the kitchen garden plan. She had the 4 pages, and she walked through them with the same steadiness she'd used for everything else, and she watched the investors the way she'd learned to watch rooms, not at their faces, which people controlled, but at their hands, which people didn't. Marsh's pen had been moving since her second page. The third investor, who still hadn't spoken, had uncrossed his arms somewhere around the frost contingency discussion. When she was done, Cordell said, "You're proposing to supply the local commercial market." "Initially local, yes. Clearwater's hotel buys dried goods from a supplier in Cheyenne. That's a significant overhead they'd reduce substantially if the supply were local and the quality were comparable or better. Our soil conditions in the lower field produce herbs with a higher oil content than the dried goods currently on the market here. Better flavor, longer shelf life." She paused. "I have a preliminary conversation noted with the boarding house in Gideon's Creek. They're interested. I haven't made commitments. That's not my place until the investment picture is clear." "What do you need from us?" Cordell said, which was the question that meant he was done being skeptical and had moved into the practical stage, which was where she'd needed him to get. "Release of the held payment," Rhett said, "and a 12-month extension on the review period. By the end of that 12 months, the secondary operation will be in its second season and the numbers will be real, not projected." Cordell looked at Marsh. Something passed between them that was abbreviated in the way of people who'd been in business together long enough to communicate in shorthand. The third investor said, for the first time, "The storm assessment is clean. I checked it against the insurance report we received last month. They match." Cordell looked at Delilah. "Miss Harper, how long have you been at Callaway Ranch?" "Since April," she said. 5 months. "Yes." He looked at Rhett. "She put this together in 5 months." "Yes," Rhett said. Cordell nodded, slowly, with the particular nod of a man conceding a point he hadn't expected to concede. "Release the payment," he said to Marsh without looking away from Rhett, "and we'll give you the 12 months. He paused. "With quarterly updates. Not from Haskell. From her." Rhett didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. "That's acceptable," she said. They drove back from Clearwater in the late afternoon with the sky going amber and the road empty in both directions, and Haskell was in the wagon bed asleep before they'd covered 2 miles, which was his particular form of relief at situations resolved. Rhett drove. Delilah sat beside him on the wagon bench, and neither of them said much for a while, and the silence was the kind that didn't need management. "Quarterly updates," he said after a while. "I know. Cordell specified you, not the ranch generally." "I noticed." He glanced at her sideways. "Does that bother you?" She considered this. "No," she said. "It means they trust the numbers. The numbers came from me. That's appropriate." She watched the land go past, the flat familiar geography of this corner of the territory that she'd learned in the months since April, the way you learn things you spend enough time inside, not by studying them, but by accumulating them, detail by detail, until they're part of you. "It means I'll need to be at those quarterly meetings." "Yes," he said. "You will. That changes things, about my role here." "It should have changed before," he said. "The problem was that I didn't have the structure in place to formalize what you were actually doing. That was my failure." She looked at him. The amber light was on his face, and he was watching the road with the steadiness he brought to everything, the horse moving at an easy pace, Haskell breathing steadily in the wagon bed behind them. "What are you proposing?" she said. "A formal partnership in the secondary operation. Not employment, a partnership. You put in the knowledge and the labor and the relationships. The ranch puts in the land and the initial capital, returns split accordingly." He paused. "And a new title for what you're actually doing, because Cook is no longer accurate." She was quiet for a moment. "What title?" "I don't know yet. Something that reflects what the last 5 months have actually been." He glanced at her again. "You could name it." "I don't need a title," she said. "I need the structure to be right. The title follows." "The structure will be right. I'll have it drawn up properly when we get back." She sat with this. The wagon moved, and the light moved, and behind them Haskell made a sound that was either a snore or a comment, and then subsided. "Rhett," she said. "Yeah. There's something else I need to say." He waited, which was the thing he did well, waiting without filling the space. "When you said you saw me," she said, "at the kitchen table that night," she kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I've been thinking about that, about what it means to be seen, and what I've done in response to not being seen, for most of my life." She paused. "I built myself into someone very self-sufficient, out of necessity, like I said. And I'm not apologizing for that, because it was what was required and it served me." "But," he said quietly, "but self-sufficiency and isolation look the same from the outside, and I'm not always sure I know which one I'm actually living in." She looked at the sky, the amber going deeper. "I know how to do things alone. I don't always know how to let things not be alone. That's something I'm going to have to figure out." He was quiet for a while. The horse's pace was steady, the road unspooling ahead of them. "I don't know how to need people either," he said. "I know how to watch them. I know how to organize around them. I spent 6 years making sure nobody got close enough to the actual thing that losing them would cost me something I couldn't recover from." He paused. "That's also isolation. It just looks like discernment." She looked at him then. "What changed?" He glanced at her. The not-quite smile, closer than it usually got. "You weren't something I could watch without it costing me something," he said. "That was new." She felt the warmth of that settle in her in the same place where I see you had landed. That deep internal place that had been unused and waiting. She did not perform a response to it. She sat with it and let it be what it was. This is going to be complicated, she said. Between us, in whatever form it takes. This is a small world we live in, and people are already deciding what they think about it. I know. Graves's story is still out there. Let it be out there, he said, with a flatness that was the closest Rhett Calloway got to contempt. You said it yourself, the true story told loud enough. I'm going to town Saturday, she said. The boarding house and the general store. I'll bring samples from the garden. I'll come. She looked at him. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. I want to. He held her gaze briefly before returning to the road. I said, I see you. That means you don't have to walk into those rooms alone anymore, unless you want to. She was quiet for long enough that Haskell shifted in the wagon bed and resettled himself. I don't want to, she said. I'm just not practiced at it. Neither am I, he said. We'll figure it out. Saturday, she walked into the Gideon's Creek boarding house with a basket of dried herbs from her garden, and Rhett Calloway beside her, and the woman behind the counter, Mrs. Aldgate, who'd been running that establishment for 15 years and knew exactly who Delilah Harper was and what the town had thought of her, looked at them both and looked at the basket and said carefully, What can I do for you? I'd like to talk to you about your supply chain, Delilah said, specifically the dried goods you're purchasing from Cheyenne. I have a local alternative I'd like you to consider. She put the basket on the counter. The thyme and rosemary and sage were bundled neatly, dried to a quality that was evident even before you opened them, the color still strong and the smell immediate when Mrs. Aldgate leaned forward to look. Where did these come from? Mrs. Aldgate said. I grew them, Delilah said, at Calloway Ranch. We're expanding the operation this fall, a proper kitchen garden, half an acre, with a full production season starting in spring. She had the paper with the pricing in her pocket, and she set it on the counter beside the basket. I'd like to discuss a contract if you're interested. Mrs. Aldgate looked at the herbs. She looked at the pricing paper. She looked at Rhett, briefly, and then back at Delilah. Sit down, she said. I'll get coffee. Delilah sat. Rhett sat beside her. And across the counter, Mrs. Aldgate began to read the paper, and what was on her face was not the expression of a woman deciding whether to take someone seriously. It was the expression of a woman already doing the arithmetic. The general store took the herbs on consignment that same afternoon. The hotel at Clearwater sent a letter 3 weeks later, responding to the note she'd sent from Rhett's Ranch Stationery, her name first, his below, expressing interest in a spring contract for rosemary, thyme, and dried sage at the volume she'd specified. Graves left Calloway Ranch on the 1st of September. Rhett terminated his employment on the grounds of insufficient contribution during the fence repair period, which was true by the numbers and documented in Haskell's foreman records, and which gave Graves nothing to argue with publicly. He left without incident, which was its own kind of answer about the kind of man he was, loud when safe, quiet when it cost something. August stayed through the winter, which surprised no one who'd been paying attention. Hector stayed too, and when the channel work started in October, he ran the crew with the efficiency of a man who'd done this before and knew what he was doing, and the channel was complete before the ground hardened, ahead of schedule. The kitchen garden was planted in March, not half an acre in the first season, a third, because Delilah had done the revised soil assessment herself over the winter and decided that slower and right was better than faster and approximate. Rhett agreed, which she noted was becoming his default response when she presented reasoning, and which she recognized was not deference but actual agreement. A man who had learned enough to know when he was being outthought on a subject and was willing to say so. There were things between them that developed the way things develop between people who've been honest with each other about hard things, unevenly, with setbacks, with the specific awkwardness of two people who'd both spent a long time being solitary learning to not be solitary. There were evenings at the kitchen table that became something she looked forward to in the way she'd learned to look forward to the pre-dawn light from the kitchen door, the quiet that contained something. There were mornings where the adjustment was obvious and imperfect, and they were both aware of it, and the awareness was its own kind of closeness. He proposed to her in October on an ordinary Wednesday morning, standing at the kitchen door in the pre-dawn dark the way they'd stood there from the beginning, though the nature of what they stood there in had changed considerably since April. He said it simply and without staging it, which was how he did everything, and she said yes the same way, directly, without excessive performance, which was how she did everything, And then they stood in the dark together while the light came up the way it always did, fast and complete. And neither of them said much because most of what mattered had already been said in the months it had taken to get here. But she thought about worth sometimes, in the way you think about something you've been turning over for 28 years and have only recently started to resolve. The world had told her for most of her life that worth was a thing you either had or didn't, visible in the right way, the right size, the right presentation, packaged correctly for the comfort of whoever was doing the evaluating. She had spent years trying to understand why she kept failing that evaluation, and longer still understanding that the evaluation itself was the problem, not the person being evaluated. What she'd learned was, not from a single revelation, but from the accumulation of ordinary difficult days on a hard piece of frontier land, was that worth wasn't something you possessed. It was something you demonstrated steadily in the presence of people capable of seeing it. And the hardest part wasn't the demonstration. The hardest part was finding the people capable of seeing it and then trusting them enough to let them. She had not done that easily. She was not, even now, entirely easy with it. She still had mornings where the old instincts ran, where she reached for the practiced steadiness before she'd even assessed whether she needed it, where the reflex to minimize preceded the thought. Old habits have deep roots, and hers had been growing for 28 years in soil that had rewarded them. But she had the kitchen garden now, in its third-acre beds with the irrigation running clean from the upper pasture, and she had the quarterly meetings in Clearwater where Cordell called her Miss Harper and meant it as a title rather than a courtesy. And she had August, who was growing into exactly what she'd said he would, and Clyde, who still brought his dishes to the kitchen without being asked, and Hector, who ran a crew with quiet authority and occasionally said things at dinner that were so precisely true that the table went briefly silent in acknowledgement. And she had Rhett, imperfect, private, still learning to stop watching and start trusting, as was she, both of them figuring out the distance between self-sufficiency and isolation on a map that didn't come with instructions. They were married in November, in the Gideon's Creek town office with Haskell and Clyde as witnesses, which was brief and accurate and sufficient, and afterward they had dinner at the boarding house where Mrs. Aldgate had set a table for them, and brought out the good china and served a meal that included, among other things, dried rosemary from the kitchen garden of Callaway Ranch, which Delilah recognized by smell before she saw it on the table and felt something turn over in her chest that was quiet and private and entirely her own. The ranch grew. The secondary operation returned its first profit in the spring, ahead of the projection, which Delilah noted in the quarterly report to Cordell with the same flatness she used for figures that fell short, because good news and bad news deserved the same unadorned delivery, and because she'd learned that the people who inflated the good news were always the same people who obscured the bad, and she intended to be neither. Gideon's Creek did not forget what it had once thought of Delilah Harper, because small towns don't forget. But the town revised its understanding in the way that towns do when they have no choice, slowly, incompletely, with pockets of resistance that diminished over time as evidence accumulated. The woman who'd been the overweight cook with no prospects became, in the town's revised account, the woman who'd seen the lower field's potential before anyone else, and built a supply operation out of it. Neither account was complete. Both were true in their way. She didn't need the town's revised version to feel like what she was. She had known what she was since well before Gideon's Creek caught up to it. But she found, in the years that followed, that it was easier to do the work when the room you walked into had some sense of who was walking in. Not because she needed the acknowledgement, but because the absence of it had always been a tax on her attention. Energy spent managing perception that she could now use for other things. She used it for other things. The kitchen garden in its second full season was 3/4 of an acre. In its third, it reached the full half-acre she'd originally planned, and the labor she'd organized to run it included 2 women from Gideon's Creek, who came out 3 days a week and whom she paid fairly and supervised without condescension, and who were, by the end of that third season, teaching the process to each other without her direction, which was exactly what she'd intended. Rhett watched this from various distances and said, one evening, "You're building something that doesn't need you to run it." "That's what building something means," she said. "If it only works when you're there, you haven't built anything. You've just become indispensable." He thought about this. "What's the difference?" "One of them is a trap," she said. "The other one lasts." He was quiet for a moment. "Which do you want?" She looked at him across the kitchen table where they'd had most of the conversations that had changed things. In the kitchen where she'd started a fire in a cold range on her first morning and made something out of what was there. The second one, she said, always. He looked at her with the look she still wasn't entirely accustomed to, direct, steady, without the filter of evaluation, and he said, "Then that's what you're building." Outside the window, the ranch was doing what it did, which was persisting. The fences holding, the lower field going through its seasonal changes, the horses in their corrals and the men at their work, and all of it continuing in the ordinary way that things continue when someone has decided they're going to keep going. Delilah Harper had made that decision at 28 in a two-room house with $7.40 and a borrowed carpet bag. She had not made it dramatically. She had not made it in the presence of anyone who would have witnessed it or been moved by it. She had made it in the way that most real decisions are made, quietly, without ceremony, in the full knowledge that nobody was coming to make things easier, and that the only way through was to start walking. She was still walking. The ground was better now. She had people beside her who meant to stay. That was not a small thing. She had never, in all the years of learning to do without, made the mistake of thinking it was a small thing. The kitchen was warm. The garden was growing. The numbers in the ledger were honest. It was enough. More than enough. It was the kind of life that asks to be taken seriously, not because it turned out perfectly, it hadn't, and it wouldn't, but because it was built from real materials, by someone real, who kept building even when the ground was hard and the voices said stop. She turned back to what she'd been doing, which was what she always did, and the ranch went on.